Thank you for joining me for the last part of the Easter story. I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. Remember, you can find this story in the Bible, in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Today, the story that I'm going to be telling is found in these scriptures. Okay, I need you to get your Bible, and I need you to go to Matthew. And in Matthew, you're going to go to chapter 26 and verse 57. That's where I'm going to start the story. Now, you're going to need to look at all of these scriptures to put the entire story together, to get the true picture of everything that I'm fixing to talk about today. Now, when we left off, we were talking about them coming, and you remember they grabbed Jesus and they arrested him and they are taking him off. And remember, Peter followed Jesus, and Peter went to the courtyard and he was warming his hands by that fire, and then they were asking him if he knew Jesus, and he kept saying no, he didn't know Jesus. Well, he was doing that because he was afraid if he told them that he knew Jesus, that he would be killed. But then, when he said that the third time, remember, the rooster crowed 2 times. And when that rooster crowed 2 times, Jesus looked at him. And Peter remembered what Jesus told him, that he would deny he even knew Jesus 3 times, and that's what he did. And Peter ran off crying. Now today we're going to find out what happens to Jesus. What did they do to Jesus? Come with me and let's find out. Now they took Jesus and they started hitting him, and they were spitting on him, and they blindfolded him, and they kept hitting him and saying, "Who hit you this time? Who hit you this time?" They were being awful to Jesus. And then they took him before Caiaphas, the high priest. And Caiaphas said, "Well, why is he here?" And they started telling false stories about Jesus, trying to find a way that Jesus would be killed. And one of the men came up and said, "Oh, I remember Jesus saying that he would destroy the temple and then in 3 days he would build it back." They said, "Okay, that's it. We can get Jesus now." And Caiaphas said, "Are you the Christ?" Jesus said, "Yes, it is as you say." But everything else that they accused Jesus of, he just stood silent and he said nothing. So they took Jesus before Pilate, the governor. And Pilate said, "Well, what has this man done?" And they start telling him of all the things that Jesus has done. And Pilate said, "Aren't you even going to say anything? Aren't you going to defend yourself?" And Jesus said nothing. And Pilate said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Yes, it is as you say." But that's it. Jesus didn't say anything else to defend himself. And Pilate said, "Well, that's not really a reason to have a man killed." Well, during the Passover time, one man was released from prison, and the people got to choose who that man was. And so they started saying, "We want Barabbas." Well, Barabbas was a notorious man. He had murdered someone. He was awful. But Pilate took Jesus and he stood him before the people. And he asked, "Who do you want? Do you want Jesus, King of the Jews? or do you want Barabbas? And the people started yelling, Barabbas! Barabbas! We want Barabbas! Pilate said, what has he done? And they yelled louder, Barabbas! Barabbas! Well, during this time, Pilate's wife sent a letter to him that said, leave this innocent man alone. I've been having awful dreams about him. But Pilate heard all the people yelling and screaming at him that they wanted Barabbas. And he said, well, what am I going to do with Jesus? And they said, crucify him! Crucify him! They wanted him crucified on a cross. And he said, but he's done nothing. And they just kept yelling louder and louder and louder. And so Pilate asked for a bowl of water to be brought to him. And he took this bowl of water and he washed his hands. And he said, this man's blood is on your hands, not mine. And the people started yelling, let it be on our hands and on the hands of our children. Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate had nothing else. There was nothing that Pilate could do. He had to give them Jesus because he knew if he did not release Barabbas, that the people would come up against him. So he gave them Jesus. They took Jesus and they tortured him. They got a crown of thorns and they stuck that crown of thorns on his head and they mashed it down harder and harder. And those thorns were sticking into Jesus' head and blood started streaming down his face as that crown of thorns was stuck on his head. Those thorns were very long. And then they took a robe and they put this robe on Jesus. And they gave Jesus a staff. And they started bowing down and saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Now they were doing this to make fun of Jesus. And they were hitting him. And they spit in his face. And they slapped him. And then they took the robe off. And they got a cat of nine tails. And they whipped Jesus and they whipped him. They were hitting him and they were hitting him over and over and over again. And his back had scars all over where they had hit him with these leather straps. And then they got Jesus. And he had been beat and beat and beat, and he was so tired. And they gave him a cross. And they said, here, you carry that cross. Well, that cross was so big and so heavy, and Jesus, he had been beat all night. And so Jesus, he could barely carry that cross. And here he is carrying the cross. And so it was very difficult for him. And he kept falling down. And they got a man named Simon of Cyrene. And they gave him the cross and said, you carry that for Jesus. And Simon carried that cross up to Golgotha, the place of the skull. And he laid that cross down. And they got Jesus. And they put Jesus on that cross. And then they took nails. And they put a nail in Jesus' hand. And they got a hammer and they started hammering that nail into Jesus' hand. And then they had another nail, and they put it in the other hand. And then they got a nail, and they put it in Jesus' feet. Then they took that cross, and they put a sign on it that said King of the Jews. Now they did this to make fun of Jesus. They picked up that cross with Jesus on it, and they banged it down into the ground. And here Jesus is. Do you see those nails in his hands? You see those nails in his feet? And do you see the bend in Jesus' legs? See, they left a bend in his legs so he could come up for air. Because when you're down, it's very hard to breathe. And putting a bend in their legs makes the death longer. Well, there were two men beside Jesus that was also being crucified. They were being crucified because they were robbers. And whenever they got Jesus on that cross, they started rolling lots, is what they called it, but it's like dice. And they were rolling those to see who was going to get Jesus' clothes. And then they said, if you're so great and you can do all these miracles, get yourself down from there. If you can rebuild the temple in 3 days, save yourself. Jesus didn't say anything. And then one of the men said to him, if you're so great, then get us all down from here. And the other man said, don't you even know who you're talking to? We're guilty for what we did. This man is innocent. He's done nothing. He said, Jesus, remember me when you go to your kingdom. And Jesus told him, today you will be with me in paradise. And then all of a sudden, everything went dark. And Jesus came up and he yelled out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he came up one more time and he said, it is finished. And whenever he said that, the curtain that was in the temple ripped from the top to the bottom. And the earth began to shake. And the rocks began to split. And Jesus took his last breath. Now, the guards were sent by Pilate to go and break the legs of the prisoners, of the men being crucified. Because it was almost time for Passover and he needed to hurry up their death. But when they got to Jesus, he was already dead. No bone was broken. They took a spear and they punched it into his side. And when they did, water and blood flowed out. Now a man named Joseph of Arimathea, he came up to them and he said, can I have Jesus' body? I have a tomb that I can put him in. And it's a brand new tomb. And Pilate said, yes, that's fine. So Joseph took Jesus and he wrapped him in a linen cloth. And then he took him to his tomb. Well, it was time for the Passover. So no one could go to him. And Joseph thought, okay, I'm going to need to put a rock in front of that tomb. So he rolled a big stone in front of the tomb. Well, some of the guards went to Pilate and the chief priest. And the chief priest told Pilate, Jesus said earlier that when he's going to die, but he will rise again to be with his Father. He will come back to life in 3 days. Pilate said, then put guards in front of that tomb. Don't let anyone get near it, because the disciples will come and get Jesus and they'll take him. And so he put guards in front of the tomb and they sealed the tomb. Well, this happened like on a Friday. And then we have Saturday. And now it's Sunday. And the women start coming to the tomb. And they thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to move that big rock out of the front of that tomb so that we can prepare Jesus' body? And then when they got to the tomb, the rock was already rolled away. The stone was rolled away. And there was an angel there. And the angel said, do not be afraid. Jesus is not here. Jesus told you that he would come back to life after 3 days. And he's not here. He's with his Father in heaven. They couldn't believe it. They didn't know what to think. And he said, come in. I'll show you. And they went in. And there's the linen cloth and Jesus is gone. He said, they go and tell the disciples. So they ran to go tell the disciples. Well, Peter and John got up and they ran to the tomb. They couldn't believe it. What happened to their Jesus? And of course, John got there and he stopped and he looked in the tomb, but not Peter. Remember Peter? Oh yeah, he walked right into that tomb because he had to find his Jesus. His Jesus is gone. What happened? Jesus had told them so many times that he was going to rise again after 3 days, but they didn't believe it. They didn't know what to think. They were afraid. So they went back to the room and they locked themselves into that room. Now remember those guards? Those guards saw everything. But they went to the chief priest and they said, Jesus is gone. And what are we going to tell Pilate? And the chief priest gave them money and said, you tell Pilate that the disciples came and got Jesus while you were asleep. And to this day, that's what they believe. Well, everybody left, but not Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene stayed, and she was crying. And a man came up to her and said, what's the matter? And she said, I don't know where they've taken my Jesus. I don't know where he is. Because she thought he was a gardener. And then he said, Mary. And then she knew. And she said, teacher. She knew it was Jesus. Jesus is alive. Jesus is not dead. Jesus is alive, and Mary saw him. Mary saw him alive. And then Mary ran to go tell all the disciples that she had saw Jesus. Jesus is alive. She saw him. He's not dead. He's not in that grave. He's not in that tomb anymore. He's alive. And then there were 2 men walking on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus comes up to them. Of course, they don't know that it's Jesus. And he says, well, what are y'all talking about? They said, where have you been? Why don't you even know what? And they start telling him everything that happened. That Jesus was crucified on a cross. And then they put him in the tomb. And now they don't know where Jesus is. They don't know who took Jesus. And so Jesus starts telling stories from Moses all the way throughout the Bible, and how this was supposed to happen. Well, then they got to their house, and they said, well, come here and eat with us. And so Jesus went in, and he took the bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke the bread. And as soon as he broke the bread, the men, their eyes were open and they knew it was Jesus. That Jesus is alive. Jesus, they saw Jesus alive. And Jesus disappeared. So they ran to the disciples to go tell them what had happened. And while they were telling the disciples what happened, Jesus appeared in the room. The room was locked, but Jesus appeared to them. They didn't know who it was. They were shocked. They were scared. Jesus said, "Don't be afraid. Here, touch my hands. It's me." And he had those scars in his hands. Jesus was with them. Jesus is alive. Well, one of the disciples was not with them on that day. And they were telling Thomas all about what had happened and how they had seen Jesus. Mary Magdalene saw Jesus alive. The two men on the road to Emmaus saw Jesus alive. They saw Jesus alive. They touched his hands. And Thomas said, "Until I can touch his hands and touch his side, I'm not going to believe." He doubted. Well, Jesus appeared a week later in that room, and there was Thomas. And Jesus went up to him and said, "Ye of little faith." And then he told Thomas, he said, "Here, touch my side." And Thomas did. And he said, "You are alive." Jesus is alive. He's not dead. He's alive. And then there was one other time that Jesus appeared to the disciples. It was the third time that he appeared to them. Peter told the disciples, he said, "Let's go out and let's go fishing." And they had been fishing all night long. And they caught nothing. And then this man showed up on the shore. And he said, "Have you caught anything?" They said, "No." He said, "Well, then throw that net over on the right side." Okay. This is a lot of fishermen. They know how to fish. But they did what the man said, and they threw that net over on the right side. And then when they started pulling that net in, there were so many fish they could hardly get it into the boat. And at that moment, they realized it was Jesus on the shore. So you know what Peter did? Oh yeah, Peter. He jumped out of that boat and he started swimming to get to Jesus. And the other men were bringing the boat in and dragging that net behind. And when they got to shore, Jesus was cooking. And they started counting the fish that they had. They had 153 large fish in that net. And they sat together and they ate. Well, then Jesus came to Peter while they were eating. And he said, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter said, "You know that I love you." He said, "Then go and feed my lambs." And then he came to Peter again and he said, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter said, "Yes, you know that I love you." He said, "Then go and feed my sheep." And then Jesus came again. And he said, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter was kind of hurt. He said, "Jesus, you know that I love you." He said, "Then take care of my sheep." See, 3 times Peter said that he didn't know Jesus. And 3 times he got to tell Jesus that he loved him. Well, then they said that Jesus appeared to over 500 people in the 40 days that he was here on earth after his resurrection. And they all got to see him alive. Over 500 people saw Jesus alive. Is Jesus alive? Yes, he's alive. Jesus is alive. And then Jesus told the men, he told his disciples, he took them up and he gave them the Great Commission. He said, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." And then Jesus, they said, went up. And he ascended back up to heaven. That means he went back up to heaven. And he is sitting on the right-hand side of his Father. He's alive. He's alive today. And he is in heaven, sitting right there beside his Father. And he knows everything about us. And he's there for us. He's there for you. He's there for me. He did all of this for you. All of it. So I just want you to remember that in John 3:16 it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life." I'm going to be talking more about this next time. I want you to talk to your parents about these things that I've been talking about. If you're confused about something, talk to your parents about it. Or you can call Brother David and he will talk to you. I don't mind talking to you. But make sure that if anything that I've said is confusing to you, please make sure that you ask somebody about that. And on this Easter, while you're hunting all those Easter eggs, don't forget what the Easter story is all about. And that's Jesus and how much he loves you. Thank you. Bye.